Good morning. Welcome. This is Mike Harris on Revolution Radio. Today is Thursday, September 18th, 2014. And today for our guest, we've got a very technical gentleman, Dr. Dan Winter. Dan, welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'm happy to have you. I know it was short notice, and I just appreciate you being so gracious and stuff. But why don't you tell us, give us a little background about who you are, where you came from, and then we can get into the discussion of some of the new physics that's coming down the pike that you've been working on. You and others are working on. Let me rephrase.
Yeah, thanks. A lot of people are familiar with my work. The main websites are goldenmean.info, particularly fractalfield.com. We also have the imploder.com, breakthrough-technologies.com, purify.com. So that gives you a flavor. I'm known internationally for inventing the concept of heart coherence. My training originally was electrical engineering, systems analyst with IBM, but most of my life was spent teaching biofeedback, physics of consciousness, science of feng shui, that sort of stuff. And now we're doing some pretty advanced technology stuff, which has pretty profound sort of psychological and spiritual implications as well.
Well, good. And what are your, well, do we want to take a historical approach as say where you started and where you came from to get here, or do you want to just jump into what you're working on now? I'll give you the choice.
I sort of had in mind jumping in. I mean, you know, I'm trying to release a new book. The new book is entitled Fractal Conjugate Space and Time, Cause of Gravity, Negentropy, and Perception. And my intention is to release that book with this new technology based on the Prairie device, which is called a rejuvenation field. It's an age reversal technology. And the principles behind that are fascinating. We can kind of work backwards, but it's a great story.
Well, I had as a guest yesterday, I had Carrie Cassidy on. I know you know who she is. I think you've been interviewed by her, actually.
I think so, yes, sometime back.
And she was talking about how certain German Nazis are still alive, and they appear as young men today. That they've somehow managed to reverse the aging process and are able to sustain themselves in their early 20s.
Yes. Well, I mean, the concept of age reversal is as old as the Bible. When they say in the Bible, I will raise a Shem unto the Lord, the Sumerian term was mistranslated to be altar in the church, where more accurately, Hashem, Sitchin translates to mean highward firestone. He means a phase conjugate dielectric capacitor, which is, because it's what's called phase conjugate, which kind of means implosive. It is an age reversal technology, which was the chief problem of our Sumerian Anunnaki ancestors. And in modern physics, is well known and documented. Time reversal is documented in phase conjugate optics. And the part of it that's most fun to discuss, I think, is that you can time reverse something back to a state of more order, but not to of less order. For example, you can time reverse rusted steel back to unrusted, but not the reverse.
Mm-hmm. And what's the process? How do we do this? I mean, let's talk about the conjugate waves.
Yeah, it's something that it sounds like science fiction initially, and we want to make the concept as realistic to people as possible. And that's where I thought I'd sort of tell the little story. So now the background. The background is, you know, originally I was somewhat famous for inventing the concept heart coherence. I taught HeartMath Institute, then my invention Heart Tuner. The whole story is at fractalfield.com/coherence. And basically, I discovered how to use what's called a second order power spectrum of the EKG. It's harmonic analysis kind of thing. And when the internal phase coherence goes up, it's literally a lie detector. It's cool because if you just said to someone, I love you, they can tell if you're telling the truth, actually, because internal phase coherence is a biologic lie detector. But in the process of doing that work, I also began playing with brain waves. And I got very excited when I met Dr. Korotkov, my buddy in Russia, invented GDV, the Kirlian technology, gas discharge visualization. And he was hired to do the biofeedback for this group, World Without Blindness Project, St. Petersburg, where they had proven that young people could see without their eyes when they would get into a certain psychological state. You could think of it as peak perception or bliss. His job was to measure that, neurofeedback. And his conclusion was that the best way to tell if someone is getting the peak perception where they're going to be able to see without your eyes is when your brain waves enter what's called golden mean ratio. Of course, that set me off. A lot of fun with that. Because I had been... Go ahead.
Sorry. Well, the golden mean has been something that has been noticed in art and in nature and in everything for centuries and centuries now. I mean, what makes the Statue of David so compelling? It's the golden mean. What makes the Nautilus shell have the perfect spiral? The golden mean. And it's amazing, and it's so beautiful in its simplicity, but yet it's so compelling. It's just it's like it attracts us to it.
It is literally the fractal attractor. And that's the point. See, so I got fired up about the serious physics of this stuff. I mean, the beauty is one thing, but it's beautiful because it's the most powerful physics of wave mechanics going. And that's where we're going with this stuff. So yes, exactly. So we found with my new invention, it was called the Bliss Tuner. You can read the whole story and see the EEG power spectra at goldenmean.info/clinical intro. And the Bliss Tuner was a device that was designed to help you get golden ratio in your brainwaves. Specifically, you start with golden ratio between the major peak in your alpha and beta. And then you get 3 to 5 harmonics in golden ratio, and you have this intense bliss state, which is literally, it triggers Kundalini, it's charge attraction, it's peak perception, it's all the above. It's the best stuff. And so I spent, 15, 20 years teaching that around the world, had all kinds of fun. But then we learned a few more things about the physics of this, which was that not only do you have the right and left hemisphere making golden ratio in the brainwave power spectrum, but also, and this is the new information, the right and left hemisphere need to be 180 degrees out of phase. Now, you can write this down. I am making this prediction that psychokinesis equals not only having golden ratio in your brainwaves, but left and right hemisphere 180 degrees out of phase. Well, now why? I have a very intense memory. I was invited to teach the Dhani Wahu's Cherokee initiation ceremonies in Vermont. And of course, the initiate there is not initiated unless they can make a flame with their mind. You know that... the Tibetan Bonpo, it's the same initiation. And there's a famous psychic, what's his name, did the remote viewing backside the moon. But he was very famous.
Igo Swan.
Ingo Swan, right, thank you.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
So when they measured him remote heating with his mind, they also measured the fact that he could do it through a solid metal screen, meaning that whatever he was radiating to make heat at a distance, the thermistor he heated at a distance with his mind, he did it in such a way that no transverse electromagnetic wave could have gone through. So now that makes you scratch your head a little bit. Well,
okay. Now, wait. Let me ask a question.
I go too fast. Sorry.
So he did this through the equivalent of a Faraday cage.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly.
Okay. All right. Just had to, just want to bring clarity. That's all.
Yeah, exactly. So there is one kind of electromagnetic which can go through the Faraday cage, which must have been how Ingo Swan lit a flame with his mind at a distance. And that is called a longitudinal electromagnetic. Now, we want to bandy these words about in a way that people really understand. So when I say longitudinal wave, think of a compressional wave, which is, most electromagnetic waves are called transverse. A transverse wave, if you have a slinky in your hand and it was wiggling up and down, that's a transverse wave. Now this is if the slinky is going right to left. Versus if you have a compressional wave, a wave of compression rarefaction going along that slinky, that's called longitudinal. And that is, for example, what most sound waves are, but almost none of our electromagnetics. So this gets into all kinds of fun stories because, when Kanzius had all those YouTube videos of lighting water aflame. He was using longitudinal radio frequencies. And when the Russians were doing the woodpecker and controlling weather at a distance, they were using longitudinal da-da-da. So it gets pretty interesting. So I think it's useful to focus on the psychophysics of psychokinesis initially, because it is so instructive that what's happening inside your head that you're calling peak perception is a form of compression called a phase conjugate pump wave. Now, in order for us to use those words happily here, we need to say more about what that means. When I say phase conjugate, when I say waves are conjugating their phases, I suggest you have a picture in your head of two pine cones learning to kiss noses. That's what I mean when I say phase conjugation. It's well documented in optics that if you have two lasers and you have them meet very precisely 180 degrees out of phase, called four-wave mixing, you create self-organization and time reversal. This is well known in phase conjugate optics. But phase conjugate dielectrics we're just beginning to learn about, and phase conjugate magnetics, I believe I have invented. Elizabeth Rauscher confirms. So what this says to us about psychokinesis is also the solution to all kinds of cool, powerful other psychophysical and physical problems. But am I going too fast, or is that clear?
Oh, no, you're going good. And one thing I have to give you a heads up on, we have a highly informed, highly intellectual listenership out here. We've, if the numbers that the server collects is right, we've got a couple million people out here listening, and it's a pretty bright group. I got to tell you. I mean, this is not your. They're at least one standard deviation above average in the population as far as intellect goes. Let's just say that.
Good. Well, I think it's because a lot of people found out that the people who understood phase conjugation as scientists went to Russia from Germany after the war. So the jet propulsion Germans went to America, but the phase conjugate Germans, the ones who knew how to make a paint that could bounce microwave on a submarine, went to Russia. So the Russians, they learned about phase conjugation in all their colleges, but the Americans,
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because that's something that people don't understand. We as Americans are somewhat self-possessed, if you will, and we think that we won the war. Well, we won the war, but the Russians really did a lot to win that war as well, and people don't realize that the intellectual property that belonged to Germany at that time was divided, and we got some, and they got other, and it's not like we got a dozen eggs and they got a sack of oranges. It was not like we got 6 eggs and they got 6 oranges. We got just the eggs, they got just the oranges. There were some clear divisions in the technologies that were distributed between the winning sides, if you will.
Yeah. And the radar scientists went to Russia, and the jet scientists went to America, and it was that simple, basically.
Mm-hmm. And then we managed to leak all of our propulsion technologies into the Soviet Union, and I don't know what we got back for it. So.
Well, the American scientists were too damn stubborn to learn about. Well, there were lots of things that affected that. First of all, the fourth element of Maxwell's equations, called the quaternion, Oliver Heaviside castrated out, and therefore Einstein didn't have a prayer of actually modeling rotation or spin, which is what the fourth element quaternion is. And
let's talk about that too, because that is something I have mentioned on this show dozens of times. That Heaviside? I didn't mention him by name, but that Maxwell's equations were tampered with. What we're taught in physics today, what we're taught in electrical engineering today of Maxwell's equations is not the complete set of equations. It's a portion of it, but it's not the entire thing, and it has been modified. And thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, well, see, that's going to become important, because the way in which it's called a polar or rotary wave it converts to a transverse and converts to a longitudinal, the way the wave mechanics convert one to the other, which involves this phase conjugate spiral kind of thing. In order to model that, you're going to need the full quaternion fourth element. The element of spin is what Heaviside castrated.
So let me ask you to speculate on something. This guy Heaviside, who do you work for, and who wanted to keep Maxwell's equations from being applied
Yeah.
completely throughout our modern physics?
Yeah, my partner Bill is absolutely convinced about the conspiracy theory of that, paid by the Rothschilds and the whole story. But I elect to ignore that at the moment. But there are people that have gone deep into that as well.
Okay, all right, fair enough. I just had to ask. That's all.
Yeah,
That's my job. I'm a radio talk show guy. I've got to
yeah,
ask these questions. It's
yeah.
my job.
Conspiracy people definitely believe the bad guys did that for sure.
It's my job to inform the people. Now, I do my best, and I have to give you a caveat on this. I try not to inject my agenda into things. I just try to let people get information. People are smart. They'll figure it out. They'll come to their own conclusions, which may be different than mine, may be better than mine. So I don't want to be like a Rush Limbaugh or a Sean Hannity that tries to only give enough information to shape an opinion the way they want it shaped, trying to guide your thought process. I try to avoid that. So anyway, I apologize. Let's continue.
No, but even to finish that thought a little bit, Red Shield Rothschild refers to two different types of Draco Anunnaki Uru blood. There was the red phosphorus and the white phosphorus, red and white Draco. Anton Parks has all the details. We know the blood chemistry. And the reason that's important, because the phosphorus was what was used to bond instead of the iron in our blood. And this comes right down in the end to why they required a high radioactive, high nitrogen environment, whereas we require a low radioactive, high oxygen environment. They had lipid blood. We had, the blood chemistry is the key to that whole conversation. And that's what's behind those whole stories of those families. And it comes down to terraforming. If you're Draco Nephilim Anunnaki Uru, you need terraforming for low oxygen, high radioactivity, and Coca-Cola and French fries are good for you, and you have an oil-based blood, and radioactivity accelerates electron transport. It is your superconductor. And the Aradia couple in Russia are a current chemical example of that kind of blood. So again, it's a science lesson about blood chemistry that's behind the whole conspiracy theory about, the history of our blood. And that switch is really central to our story, because now we're getting to the part currently where we're going to say, if you want to terraform this planet, which is to say return it to negentropy, self-organization, you're going to need this phase conjugate pump wave, which is called the Schumann resonance. And that is the difference. And so let's go back to the science with that thought specifically. I said that a very particular phase conjugate pump wave is the origin of all negentropy. That is the title of my book. Now, I say that phase conjugate pump wave is very precise. It is Planck length and time, and that is the universal key signature of everything in physics. And you do simple, precise whole exponents of golden ratio. And if you do that, then you get the virtually exact frequencies of the Schumann resonance, which now we know what to call it. It is a phase conjugate pump wave. A phase conjugate pump wave is what you pump in, the longitudinal, that you pump in to get something to self-organize, become negentropic and self-organizing. This is, and by the way, this then again predicts exactly those frequencies of brain waves we measured for Bliss, which are the same harmonic series. It predicts the exact frequencies that Prior used for pain elimination and rejuvenation. The frequencies Rausch are used for pain elimination magnetically. It predicts the exact duration of the Earth year and Venus year, and it predicts the exact frequencies of photosynthesis. So phase conjugate pump wave is the key, I believe, to every single form of negentropy, including the cause of gravity, which we know is negentropic, which means self-organizing. So to take a practical example of that, you got a planet, and someone observed, I think his name was Lovelock, the planet was negentropic, which is to say it appears to self-organize, frequency, temperature. It's called Gaia. Now, others recently have observed, oops, we're going into chaos. Now, I say if you understand the phase conjugate pump wave that keeps the planet negentropic, you can fix it. And that's where I'm going with this.
Okay. So what are they doing with this chemtrail spraying? I've heard 1,000,005 theories, but let's come back to that. You answer that later, but continue on your line of thinking here, because you've got me scratching my head already.
Well, I'm saying that if you understand one mechanism and cause of negentropy, self-organization, which I say is the cause of perception, gravity, life force, and all negentropy, you can fix any chaotic system. And I use the example of the planet but we're also using the example of regenerative fields and gravity making and other systems. So the thing we need to focus on at the beginning of the conversation is the actual mechanism of negentropy or self-organization itself. What causes it? And it is a form of implosion. Our group is called Implosion Group. We have research centers in Canada, Australia, and Brazil, and New Zealand. And what is implosion? Implosion is the centripetal force which phase conjugates make. Practical example, Schauberger had a water vortex. It would spin around 50,000 RPM. It was piezoelectrically doped with trace mineral. And when that vortex began spontaneously getting colder, called negentropy, it was when he knew it was going to start making voltage from gravity. And that electric power he got as a generator was so effective that Hitler wrote him a check, basically. That's an example that the onset of negentropy is precisely how you extract power from the vacuum.
And you're talking about the work of Victor Schauberger, correct?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, I mean these are Maxwell Schauberger. They were nearly contemporaries in time in the 19 teens and the 1920s, if my memory serves me well. And their work is almost unheard of. It's hard to find, and it just shows to me the coordinated effort to eliminate these very valuable ways of thinking and ways of approaching engineering and physics problems that people tried to scrub out of existence.
An implosion was the genius of Schauberger, which is to say, he learned it by watching implosion in water, implosion in high energy lakes, etc. And he designed all these vortex technologies. In fact, now my agricultural water treatment, probably the best in the world. We get regularly 30 to 300% growth benefit, theimploder.com. The vortex nozzle I designed, called Schauberger's Dream, takes my equation for the origins of negentropy, which is basically 5 golden spirals on a cone, which is how you build hydrogen and DNA. And the angle of that cone is 60 degrees. It's the pure implosion cone. It's the same cone angle that best made rain in the Reichian weather engineering on the high seas. It's the best implosive capacitor. And so that cone angle is an angle that creates negentropy, which is to say suction to center, which is to say implosion. So if I could try to describe as accurately as possible why there is a centripetal force electrically, and the way I'd like to do that is to describe what I believe is the only cause of gravity. I wrote a new equation for the radii of hydrogen, and it's the same equation I just described: Planck length, precise exponents, golden ratio, and bang on, you have the radii of hydrogen. So if you build a 3-dimensional geometric model, and you can order the kit, goldenmean.info/kit, of hydrogen, which is just basically infinite interdigitation of dodecahecos and dodecahecos, called Star Mother. It's called Lesser Meson Theosophy. And it's also a model of DNA in every living protein. Very cool. And so why is there gravity in hydrogen? If you take a top-down view of hydrogen or DNA, it's the same. You have 10 spirals of the golden mean going down this 60-degree cone. And gravity exists only and because, in my view, that as those waves of charge cross in the golden mean spiral called phase conjugation, not only do the wavelengths add and multiply constructively, and only golden ratio allows the adding and multiplying to both be constructive. That's why it is the solution of compression, therefore the solution of implosion. But also, the phase velocities add and multiply constructively. So when the electric wave phase velocity adds and multiplies constructively, that and only that form of compression becomes acceleration. So a portion of the charge energy that's going down this golden ratio cone, translating transverse to longitudinal, compressional, the phase velocities of the electric charge add and multiply constructively, and that turns compression of charge into the acceleration of charge, which I say is the only definition of gravity, acceleration of charge. And we all know that gravity is indistinguishable from acceleration. So now you know why acceleration of charge exists and the charge accelerates out through the center of the hydrogen atom and goes through the speed of light, and that's been measured. The phase velocities faster than the speed of light are multiples of Golden ratio times the speed of light, as Raymond Chow is finding out.
Okay, Dan, we've got a break coming up here. We'll have about 4 minutes of downtime here. So go get a glass of water or whatever you need to do. We'll be right back, folks. More with Dan Winter talking about not new physics, but rediscovering physics that's been there for over 100 years. We'll be right back, folks. Good morning and welcome back. This is Mike Harris on Revolution Radio. Today is Thursday, September 18th, 2014. My guest today is Dan Winter. Dan, welcome back to the show. And I tell you, I'm a physics technology junkie. My undergrad work was in solid state physics and material science, and this conversation we're having has just got me intrigued. So I'm glad to have access to someone with a knowledge base and a mind like yours. And thank you so much for coming on the air.
Well, we might have a little more fun here. I mean, we were trying to say why, when charge goes down a golden spiral, it creates centripetal force and gravity. And I think we can get from there to, real solutions, propulsion, plasma physics, and how you steer after death and have a lot of fun with it. So that's where I was going.
Okay, well, let's keep going.
Well, so, I mean, if you followed where we were, I proved that golden ratios, of course, all over the structure of hydrogen and DNA. That was known before. And the hydrogen bond is the center of every DNA ladder rung anyway, the lightning zipper. But I proved that the radii of hydrogen are precise golden ratio multiples of Planck length. So that proves that this golden spiral cone is basically probably what's holding hydrogen together, which I say is the reason that gravity exists. Now, I'm hoping your readers will visualize this pretty carefully for themselves. Visualize. Remember what I said phase conjugation is: two pine cones learning to kiss noses, a vortex. And a good way to imagine that is to understand why life force exists. If you measure the voltage difference between the top and bottom of a pine cone or a chicken egg, you get about 4 to 12 millivolts. And the reason there's voltage there, it comes from gravity. It's called life force. And the reason a pine cone and a chicken egg can get voltage from gravity is because they're implosive capacitors. And there's actually an electric pressure difference between the sharp end and the dull end of an egg shape of a pine cone or chicken egg. And that difference in voltage is life. And that's what the fields of form, vortex of life, Lawrence Edward, famous anthroposophic stuff is about. So the point we're focusing on here is a pure principle of why at the center of this and only this golden spiral do you actually have centripetal force, sometimes called gravity or perception of negentropy. And if we can understand that, then we can understand implosion physics, we can understand the solution of fusion, its interferometry, we can understand how you navigate your aura after death. There's all the stuff about nonlinear gravity and nonlinear propulsion. We got to get that clear in our head. And there's two ways I'd like to give examples. Okay, remember what we're talking about. We got a golden spiral on a cone or a torus, which is the shape of hydrogen DNA. And we also know that the Earth grid is dodeca, has the same shape, and the arrangement of interstellar masses is dodeca. So that's all the same pent nesting, and every living protein, by the way. So let's use two examples now. First, let's go back to the Nazis. They were studying the Vedas, and we have engineering prints for the Vimana, their UFO spacecraft. Mm-hmm. And the way the Vimana flew was they pumped a high inertial liquid in, guess what? Spiral on a torus. And this is called impulse power in Star Trek. And you produce highly efficient gravity propulsion, actually much more efficient than jet engines, which are terrible. And so the Nazis studied this, and they realized that the inertia is maximized if it's also a magnetic flux dense. So you had to have a soluble iron powder in the mercury. And that's why we know the Nazi bell, the liquid they pumped was called red or purple. And it's a iron powder impregnated mercury. And there's a secret to how to get that soluble in there. And we'll keep that confidential for the moment. But anyway, the point is, so you've got a high inertial and magnetic flux in a very accurate trajectory on a torus. We have the equations to optimize this, and you produce this amazing gravity called impulse power. All Star Trek people know about it. Now, when you learn about the golden spiral in hydrodynamics class, it's called optimized translation of vorticity. What they mean is you're translating rotational inertia to linear inertia, which is to say rotational power to propulsion. And the second example I'd like to use, well, first, did I go too fast for that part?
Oh, no. That was good. That was good.
Okay. So the second example I'd like to use, I took that, many years ago, I wrote this equation to topologically superpose mathematically. Well, I should say, by the way, the mathematics for what I just described is all at fractalfield.com/mathematics of fusion. And there you see the wave equation proof. The golden ratio is the solution to constructive wave interference, therefore the solution to compression, therefore the solution to gravity fusion, and all this other cool stuff. So I took the same equation, golden spiral, on a torus, and I cast shadows based on the symmetry of the tetra. And I showed that those shadows are Hebrew and Sanskrit. Beautiful animations. We had 1 million visitors a month. See the animations in 3D. goldenmean.info/DNA ring. So basically, you got this archetype spiral on the torus, and you index the shadows, and you get Hebrew and Sanskrit. Why? And that's the point I'd like to make about propulsion.
Okay.
We know that after death, and when you lucid dream, you basically travel as a bubble of charge. Korotkov measured this. We know why you go where you go after death. You go to the place of charge in the room because you need the form of compression that becomes acceleration, et cetera, et cetera. It's called place of power. And we actually know why you see what you see when you die. What you see when you die is called a Clouvet form constants, a sequence of geometries. Heinrich Clouvet did the science on this, is lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral. And we know why you see that just when you die, because you're seeing the sequence of braid operations that's allowing your DNA to implode your plasma, which makes you plasma projectable, which is how you can get some memory through death. You can see the animations, goldenmean.info/immortality. So the point is that the vehicle you take with you when you lucid dream or when you die is called your ka, as in Merkaba, meaning in Egypt, boat into the underworld. In science, that means the amount of coherence in your aura. So you got this charge bubble donut, and you got to navigate the blooming thing. Well, how are you going to steer? The answer to that question, remember, how much you can take with you when you lucid dream is a good indicator of whether you're going to take memory when you die. So you should practice. So how do you practice?
That's kind of funny, actually. So how do you practice?
You practice navigating. So supposing you were a Hebrew rabbi and you need to make a golem, you got the right sequence of Hebrew letters. Let me give you an example of a sequence. Bereshith, the first word of Genesis, is usually translated in the beginning, but Faber d'Olivet did a better job in Hebraic Tongue Restored. He transliterated by taking the shape letters themselves, and he transliterated that to mean at first, in principle, the origin of thingness, the first word of the Bible. And if you take the symmetry operations, Bereshith, if you're looking at the golden spiral on the torus, Mobius, which is the origin of all self-organization, and you're on the outside in, from the outside and looking at that spiral first, the shadow that is like a cup shape is the Hebrew letter bet. And you walk 1/7 way around the spiral and you look at the center again. Now you see the shadow, and that's the turning point in the shadow from that angle is resh, the Hebrew letter R, which means to turn, literally turn inside out, which is what R means in every language, by the way, et cetera, et cetera. And so the last letter, you're now on the inside looking out, and you see the letter He, which means pi squared the circle, amorphous space filling the breadth of charge, fiveness. And so you spelled Bereshith, the first word of Hebrew for the Bible, and you've done the sequence of turns of mind necessary to turn inside out on the surface of a torus, which is the physics of how waves learn to turn inside out, which is at first, in principle, the origin of thingness, because creation exists when charge learns to turn inside out on the surface of torus. You get the idea. So this is symmetry operations for turns of minds, the physics of creation. We knew that many years ago, but the thing we didn't know was the physics of the origin of propulsion itself, and how you would then use the Hebrew letters. If you're a ghost or you're a shaman or you're a navigator, shaman just means plasma projective shaman. You got to be able to push this plasma donut around because, you're an astronaut and you got a torus of charge, a bubble, and the only thing you got to steer it with is the torus of charge. Your thrusters are what? Your thrusters is the fact that the spiral on that torus, the relative angle of that spiral is projective propulsion in that symmetry index sequence you see. So it's literally how you steer. Supposing you're an angel, this is what Ophanim Enochian is about. Angel alphabets, goldamean.info/Ophanim, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an example of the origins of propulsion. Now there's a more advanced example. This was what's called warp, but the other one is, this was called impulse power. The other one's called warp power. But am I going too fast?
Oh no, see, here's the good news. If you go too fast, we're going to keep archives of this, and people can go back and play this back again and again until they understand it. So let's stay on track, and thanks for asking. That's a good thing.
Well, so we're trying to understand this phase conjugate and longitudinal wave mechanics, origin of propulsion, origin of compression, origin of fusion, origin of plasma containment, origin of gravity, origin of negentropy, and we're trying to use practical examples. So the second example of nonlinear propulsion I'd like to propose here is called Koski-Frost. Now, the Koski-Frost was basically a quartz crystal cube, and if you pump, when they make a phase conjugate mirror in optics, they pump lasers into a cube. It's called four-wave mixing, and they create self-organization and negentropy and time reversal. It's well known in physics. But if you take the perfect phase conjugate pump wave, and I just told you what the equation was, and you pump that into this quartz crystal cube, you know what you get. You get, by measurement, about 800 times the gravitational propulsion of the weight of that crystal. This is called Koski-Frost. It was done, it's the Bell. This is a serious, well-documented, the electronics radio journals. And, of course, this
is known good physics. This is not theoretical. This is hard. This is proven. This is stuff everybody in the field knows.
Well, they should know, but the problem was apparently somebody, we assume the U.S. government, systematically went to every university library in the country and removed all the Koski-Frost articles. It's really cool. So there's a smoking gun here, but I'm just focused on the physics for the moment. And the physics is that a phase conjugate wave, which is, the conjugate pump wave in this quartz crystal cube, converts the piezoelectric pressure in a phase conjugate, which is, remember, pine cones kissing noses, it converts it directly into a compressional wave, in this case, a gravity wave. And this is what's called warp power in Star Trek. And in fact, they call them dilithium crystals. It's actually lithium niobate, which is a fast phase conjugator. So you see, all this stuff about origin propulsion actually has to do with origin psychokinesis, and So anyway, the next subject was to apply this to plasma containment, because I think, and I was telling Brett the other night, that they wasted enough money to feed Africa for a decade on these Bloomin' atom smashers, ITER, and all these
CERN, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. One of the scientists at CERN came to my lectures years ago in Geneva, and he says, you don't want to go there. That's a Nephilim institution. I don't think I knew quite what he meant at the time. But again, back to the science. The science is that clearly the mind is able to create heat at a distance through a Faraday cage. So why the H cannot our plasma physicists trying to do fusion? And the reason is because they're too stupid to know what a longitudinal wave is and how to make it and how to focus it. And that's sad, because we could have fed Africa. And I don't like that. So I think we should fix that. That's my humble opinion. Anyway.
Well, I people are working on it. People are working on fixing it as we speak. That's why we talk.
Let's assemble that team. That's my vote. And so we have this network around the world, and we think we have the pieces of this team. And I think you have some great pieces, so I'm pleased to play. This is good news. But to try to complete the physics lesson, because, see, I think if people can visualize the pure principle for themselves, the real self-empowerment wave mechanics, then the message becomes self-organizing itself. So I'm for having people actually understand for themselves how and why that worked, Then they can go to their dumb physicist who doesn't know why an object falls to the ground and tell them, get educated. So
there you have
the way it happens in the mind is clear. It's called the flame in the mind. And your brain waves are making this golden ratio cascade. It looks like caduceus, in fact.
So how does one train themselves to produce the flame in the mind?
Good question. Good question. If you ask the Cherokee shaman or the Bon Po making a bonfire, they talk about this discipline of total focus. But if you are a wave mechanic and you need to know what total focus is, you find out that focus only becomes centripetal when it's phase conjugate, which is why, I thought I was the first to propose phase conjugation as the cause of perception, but I'm not. Steve Lehar has a beautiful phase conjugate model. But the point is that the flame in the mind is born when waves converge in a particular geometry. And that geometry, if you take this golden ratio cascade and plot it in a cascade, you make what's called the caduceus, which in physics is called phase conjugation. So guess what? Everything I'm saying is the climax of what it means to be called hermetic. And so the right and left hemispheres make this golden ratio. And to try to answer your question, I will tell a short story. We were there in, it was in Melbourne, Australia, and we had a shaman with us, and we were measuring golden ratio in the brainwaves of this very nice lady. And the problem was she couldn't focus and she couldn't hang in there. She couldn't sustain it. And so, I had a device called my Bliss Tuner. Very few brainwave people know this, and it's sad because you can fix perception, you can fix ADD, you can create bliss. And by the way, if you don't have bliss, you are electrically a parasite, so you need a source of your own charge. So anyway, this lady couldn't quite da-da-da, and the shaman takes her out during lunchtime, and they do this thing where they relive some pain, serious trauma, pain, heavy duty, stuff. And she cries. And then she comes back after lunch, and we get her on this brainwave thing, and bang on 3, 4, 5 harmonics, golden ratio and EEG, total focus. And she's there having this incredible bliss experience. You can see the brainwave 3D plots, goldenmean.info/clinical intro. I mean, cool stuff. So her answer to your question of how did she get there would be, she made her memories shareable.
Okay. So she dealt with her trauma and it eliminated what had been holding her back.
That's right.
So that she could move forward. Okay, got it.
Anytime there's a discontinuity in memory, the inertia of your aura is limited. That's why, for example, at birth, the best birth canal is golden ratio, and if you come out of the womb underwater, the pressure reduction in the spine is more gradual, and you get more implosion, more memory comes through. So it's all about continuity of memory, which requires this phase conjugate harmonic cascade. So if you got some block in memory, you're in trouble.
Well, let me ask you a related question. What about those who've had forceps type births where they've had to be pulled and have had other trauma at birth?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the classic story for this is called the book Bond of Power by my friend Joseph Chilton Peirce. He says, Caesar made war on the Druids and killed them because he didn't have a birth canal. It's called cesarean section. Therefore, he could not bond with his mother and his family and the land, and therefore he could not feel. But the physics of empathy, you see, is a bonding process, which is called perfected embedding, perfect nesting. Now, what happens when you do have a birth canal called you couldn't get a better squeeze is that all the wavelengths from short to long conjugate, and that's called continuity of memory. Literally, the places of the stars at the moment of birth come through. It's a physics of rebirthing. Read John Diamond, Profound Rebirthing, placental extract, belly of the surrogate mother, deep breathing. It's all about compression. But the map of the perfect compression, called the perfect birth, if you do a map of the perfect birth canal, there's something called a centric wave shape for love, where if you take thousands of people and have them touch a violin string and say, I love you, you get a geometry of pressure over time. And that wave shape, it reaches max pressure at golden ratio, which is called implosive phase conjugate, and that's the perfect birth canal. And that is how implosion brings memory through birth. It's the physics of rebirthing. There's lots of ways to redo that. But so yes, from this point of view, cesarean section, for example, is a great tragedy for people being able to feel empathy, because you can't, of course, begin the whole cascade of bonding processes unless you start with the perfect bond. So anyway, physics of rebirthing is very important.
Okay, well let's continue here because you're putting together a very logical sequence. I want to know what's next.
Well, so we described two different forms of propulsion. We said impulse power. If you do the correct math, Navier-Stokes, to get the idealized equation for golden spiral on the torus, and you pump both high inertial liquid at enough volume and high magnetic flux density, you get amazingly efficient propulsion. And by the way, you take your own inertial field with you so you don't feel a turn. We've seen all the UFOs do it. Now we know how they do it. But the more advanced is what's called the warp power, when you're really warping space. And that's where we put a phase conjugate wave into the quartz cube or other piezo fast conjugators like lithium niobate, and you make this high density gravity wave. It's all based on what we come back to in every part of our conversation here, which is Planck length, Planck time, the universal sacred wavelength, all physics, precise exponents of golden ratio times that, you get this equation. And that's the perfect phase conjugate pump wave, which is the origin of all negative entropy self-organization, cause of gravity, cause of perception, cause of negative entropy, cause of life force. So you begin to recognize how to bring things out of chaos. You know the principle. Physicists finally could agree that gravity is negentropic, and physicists know, for example, that focused human attention is electrically negentropic. You have famous Bill Tiller, who was a friend, wrote the book Conscious Acts of Creation. He proved 100 different ways that focused human attention causes electric fields to compress. I am the first one to explain why, because focused human attention is a phase conjugate pump wave causing negentropy, which is to say a centering force. It's very simple. And so that is the beginning of fixing everything about our universe. From the phase conjugate pump wave that is the Schumann resonance, you can pump it back into the earth and make it more negentropic. You take the same frequency cascade and you get the photosynthesis frequencies, which means now you know why, if you remove the poisonous fluorescent light out of your kid's classroom and install sunlight, you get dramatic measured increase in attention span. You actually know how to fix it. You know the exact frequencies that, almost exact, that Elizabeth Rauscher used for pain reduction, intermagnetics, and the exact frequencies Prior used, thousands of cases of cancer rejuvenation. It's the same harmonic frequency cascade. So once you understand the beginning of this conversation, which is the perfect phase conjugate pump wave, you can bring any wave system out of chaos.
Okay. All right, well, this is a great place for our break. We've got our top of the hour break, Dan. Stick with us, folks. We'll be back right in just a few minutes at the top of the hour break, more with Dan Wenner. So stick with us. We'll be right back.
Thank you. Hi there, Mike. You there?
Mike, are you muted?
Maybe I'll just continue here, shall I?
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
So we're telling a story here. We're trying to empower people so they can understand for themselves how the flame in the mind is created. And by using that clear visualization, we can apply that to breakthrough physics. I'd like to use an example. When in the Steiner anthroposophic or biodynamic tradition, when you're teaching the young people the importance of the accuracy of visualization, they use an exercise which is instructive here. That exercise is the young people are taught to very accurately draw a sequence of pictures of a rose opening, so accurately that they can visualize inside and create that inner image, I magnify, imagine, I magnify, with such power that their inner visualization is psychokinetic. This is the beginning of real creation mechanics inside the optical cortex, the optical hologram, as it were. And the point is that the if children, for example, see too much TV, particularly before age 7, they lose the inner muscle to make an inner picture in their mind for themselves because they're passive. The too many images are made for them. You don't get to make your own. And so you need to develop this inner muscle to make this clear picture inside your head, because that's the beginning of you participating with the physics of creation.
Well, Dan, let me ask you a real quick question here. Is this why it's important for children to daydream?
Exactly. Very good. Yes. In fact, it's because you're exercising that inner muscle that allows you to shape the charge waves in your own optical cortex hologram in such a way that you are the creator. You're not passively watching your YouTube. You're in fact making the image for yourself, which is why it's correct in the Steiner tradition that you should not be watching too much external image making equipment when you're too young, because you lose that muscle. The point I was going to make about this exercise is that in the classroom, the kids they're drawing this sequence of a rose opening, then they close their eyes and they focus and they work really hard and they make the rose open inside their head. Now, do you know what the test is to know that they've succeeded? It's so fun.
What?
The classroom must fill with the smell of roses.
Okay, that's a tough one.
Here's the physics. The brain is literally a flowering brain. It's imploding, and it's creating the nectar of bliss. And we're going to get to Kundalini biomechanics. But the nectar of bliss, some people don't know, but Callahan proved that olfaction is not a particle. Sorry, wrong. No, olfaction is mediated largely in the infrared. If you've ever seen the hummingbirds smash into the windows of the sealed house trying to get at someone who's having bliss, you know that the bliss smell goes through. So the brain creates this beautiful infrared, and you can measure the Kundalini in the microwave, that's Dratch's ATP work, etc. So here you have the flowering brain triggered by this exercise, ability to make the image inside. Now, this was an introduction to this exercise, which is, can you visualize for yourself how the waves inside your head make a flame in the mind? That's the challenge of the moment. Because if you could visualize that, then psychokinesis is yours. And oh, by the way, you can solve the problem of microwave longitudinal for fusion work, you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've also touched on something else. You know, one thing I like about reading books versus watching TV or movies is when you read a book, your mind creates its own imagery.
Exactly.
You see the words on the page, but oftentimes I find myself, I'm lost. I'm not on the page. I'm in the book. I'm somewhere else. I've created another existence around me. And I think these are the same muscles you're talking about.
Exactly. In fact, the very word imag, image, imagination, mag, matrix of Agni, matrix of fire. The matrix of fire is a phase conjugate pump wave, pine cones kissing noses. So what's happening in your brain, you got this golden ratio harmonic cascade right left. And by the way, the golden ratio starts with alpha to beta. Alpha to beta is, the alpha frequency, is the Schumann harmonic, which also is a perfect equation for phase conjugate pump wave. So the Earth is doing the same thing to make a mind. In fact, the first scientists who were shown the Schumann harmonics refused to believe it wasn't the EEG of a person. Because it's the same harmonic series, the same perfect. So inside your head, you're making, the right hemisphere has to be 180 degrees out of phase of the left hemisphere, because you know how the pine cones have to meet. It's a perfect compressional wave. It's called infinite non-destructive compression, Einstein's recipe for the unified field. Too bad nobody ever told him what a fractal was. And so you get this compressional wave that's non-destructive all the way down to the nuclear level, and at the level of Planck, the charge is a phase accelerated through the speed of light by the same sequence of harmonics, golden ratio times the speed of light. And that's where you get these wormholes between your center of gravity, the Earth's center of gravity, the Sun's center of gravity, that are, you know, how planets and stars experience gravity relations erotically. It goes on and on. So inside your head, there's this implosive wave mechanic that's not just your head, and this is where we hopefully would introduce the biophysics of Kundalini. Biophysics of Kundalini resolves to actually the low frequencies of the spine liquid pump called sacrocranial, and I just did a new plot. The classic upledger frequencies of the spine liquid pump sacrocranial. You know, he's the first one to prove that if your spine liquid is pumping, it is clinically impossible to be depressed. And guess what the frequencies are?
Schumann resonance.
Exactly the same harmonic cascade. So, you know, when Bentov used capacitive accelerometrics to prove the physics of Kundalini, and he was my teacher, he actually was showing the liquids of the spine liquid climax in this caduceus, same vasoconstricting wave, at the ventricle liquids, which complete these horn shapes, which is a cone called getting horny, and it is pumped sex juice. And that focuses a phonon wave on the pineal pituitary, and there you go. You got this pine cone shaped implosion, feels like inner fire, red hot poker going up your tailbone, the whole Kundalini. And we have this whole biophysics from Bentov's story, goldenmean.info/Kundalini. But you see, this is the first moment at which you implode charge, and therefore the first moment at which you have your own source of charge, which is to say, if you have bliss, that's the first time you're not a parasite. And bliss is actually how you get an immune system. And as we say, bliss is actually the only way you get coherent enough aura to take memory through death. So we know why the word polis, as in body polis, the origin of the term politic, refers to whether you have a coherent bliss charge plasma aura, because the function of politics is to make bliss. I'm sure George Bush maybe didn't know that, but oh well.
Well, let me ask you a question. You know, since we have all of this frequency and resonance going on around us, and we're also in the modern age now, over the last, let's say, 30 years since the invention of the cell phone, how are we interfering with these things? Do we have a clue as to what the Wi-Fi, what the cell phone, what all of this does? I mean, you know, how badly are we skewing?
It is catastrophic. It is absolutely catastrophic. The frequencies they modulate, the higher F for the harp is the same frequencies of the Schumann, the same 0 to 20 hertz, which means, you know, this harp system, and even the Wi-Fi is modulated. And I mean, you know, and 60 cycle was the voltage, the frequency at which the voltage required to stop the heart was lowest. So it's literally as if there has been a huge conspiracy to prevent electrical biological life force to exist. It's an absolute tragedy. And the fact is, most children will never get bliss because they don't have an electrical environment that makes it even possible. I mean, if you're living in air-conditioned air, for example, if you're living in a metal building, it means the Schumann resonance never even gets inside, which means you don't have a prayer. It's really sad.
Well, let me make a direct experience statement about that. You know, I went through some financial, how do I say this, turmoil for a while. I mean, during the 2007, 2008, it took a year and a half or so to catch up with me. I lived in a all metal travel trailer for about 2.5 years. It aged me. It took me away from the planet, if you will, and it was it was a good experience for me. It humbled me, you know, from coming where I came from, but by the same time, I aged more in that environment than I had before or have since, and so it's just something that people need to be aware of. You don't want to live in metal buildings. You want to live in something as Earth-like as possible. And
that resolves to a very specific science, which is the real physics of biologic architecture. We have an international curriculum. It's all at goldenmean.info/architecture. And it's simple. It means, the reason you want living material making your building what was once part of life is because of high dielectric constant, which means simply ability to resonate charge, which means simply if your aura can breathe through your building, then you can inhabit the building. So living buildings are the opposite of steel and aluminum because they have the correct dielectric constant. And the way your biology teacher should teach that is you just put a few seeds in a steel and aluminum cup and watch them die. And then you'll decide not to put your kids there.
Well, let me say this about that. I had previously lived in an Adobe home that I had built.
Cool.
and
Nice.
19-inch thick walls. I mean, just it was a wonderful structure.
Oh,
It was
yeah.
it was the happiest I'd ever been.
Exactly. And so that is a science. And that science needs to be taught at university level. And our biological architecture curriculum now is taught in dozens of countries, and we're making progress. We had international conferences in Mexico and in Wales on this. And the principle is so simple. The way we start the curriculum is to say, you decide if the architect gets a paycheck after you measure whether the electric field of the building causes a seed to germinate, which was called the SHEM. And we described 3 different measurement technologies. One is the biophoton, another is the GDV. Basically, at the center of the cavity where you want to find out if you have sacred space, you put this thing called a GDV Sputnik, which measures charge distribution efficiency, which is called sacred space. But let me tell you the story in a very simple way. Korotkov, who originally discovered this, followed the Kogi shaman to the place where they could make phone calls to their ancestors, which is obviously survival critical. And he measured the air there with this. It's just you're measuring whether a capacitor has a place to distribute its charge, which is the principle of John's, Gion, ion, etc., perfect branching. So charge distribution efficiency measures sacred space because it measures whether the electric field is able to propagate its charge non-destructively, which is the definition of all biology, because charge distribution efficiency equals life. And this is what, Albert Szent-Györgyi, Nobel-winning electronic biology and cancer, triplet-state electron. It's all about simply charge distribution efficiency. And that's what's called high dielectric constant. So this is the physics which you use to teach your architecture teacher why steel and aluminum are poisonous to every living thing. And then you get into the electrosmog stuff. And, Feng Shui is wonderful. We get taught physics Feng Shui for years. But the Feng Shui master never had to deal with electrosmog because it didn't exist when they invented Feng Shui. So you need to teach it based on the physics principle. But Feng Shui always knew that a right angle was evil, but now we know why, because electrically that kind of capacitor creates destructive wave interference.
Gotcha. Okay. So these are all the things that have been known, but nobody in the Western world has applied.
Yeah, I think. And again, it's a matter of if you can understand the pure principle, then suddenly it's not miracle worship and personality worship, when religion becomes a parasite. No, it's self-empowerment, which is what this is all about. So that's where I was trying to go with this idea about if you can imagine inside your head how you make a flame in the mind and how you would move that. So then we took that physics to the microwave longitudinal, the solution to plasma fusion containment. It's the same thing. If you know how, there's 2 ways to make a longitudinal microwave. One is a recursive microwave dish, which actually uses whole number lambda wavelength differentials to create a longitudinal wave in the right curvature. And then you've got a longitudinal microwave. The thing that most scientists don't realize is that then if you take a couple of those dishes, and this is the secret, and we're not releasing where we keep this stuff. We have centers on about 5 or 6 continents, but we have access in the team and with the right team members. But if you take those longitudinals and you focus them at a distance, guess what happens when you rejoin these compressional longitudinal waves at a distance? That at the reconvergence point, if it's conjugate to angle, which would be 90 degrees, 180 degrees, suddenly the longitudinal, and visualize again pine cone braiding, pine cones, kissinosis. The longitudinal compressional wave reconverges back into a transverse wave, and that is heat creating. That is the flame at the distance. That's the physics of how the Nazis made the Foo Fighter, and that's the physics of how you make a lightsaber for Star Wars, and that's the physics of plasma containment at a distance, the solution to all the fusion dramas of planet Earth, and that's how you make a flame in the mind.
Well, Dan, one thing that's jumping off the page at me after listening to you is that all of this knowledge has been right in front of us for centuries.
Yep.
Centuries. It's been right in front of us.
Yep.
And yet, somehow, it's been hidden from our view.
Yep.
When you were talking about the white phosphorus and red phosphorus being the basis of the bloodlines and stuff,
yeah,
it's the conclusion I've come to is that humanity has been interfered with for at least 5,000 years. And that we've not been allowed to flourish on our own. That there's been outside forces suppressing us. Any thoughts on this? Any comments?
Well, I've got about 150 articles on the web about my view of the ET origins of DNA. Goldenmean.info/the rest of the story. And I'm happy to dance with that a little bit. I think that, ultimately the history story is optional, but what is not optional is the physics. So I usually tell the history story in terms of the blood chemistry. And for the history story, I wrote a book, Enki's Origin of DNA and goldenmean.info/Enki. But I think now the best telling of that history story is Anton Park's work, just translated in English. It's great. It's, Testimony of the Virgin and all those wonderful Anton Parks books. And basically, you see, Anton Parks, how he got the info the same way I did? Intense Kundalini when he was young. He downloaded Enki's iPhone. It's called a digital voice recorder called a Girku Vril or a Toy Stone Fire Crystal. And he is now a more detailed historian than Sitchin or Gardner or anybody. You got to read some Anton Parks. But the part of the story that I would like to dance with for a few minutes, since you invite, is the blood chemistry part of the story. Because that's where I think, people get all a little bit miffed if the history story isn't provable. But once you get to the chemistry and you can check, that's where it's, self-empowering. So the blood chemistry, I think, is the most instructive part. So basically, Sumerian, Anunnaki, Nephilim, Draco, they're called Uru, S-M-E-B, Uru, etc., Ural, and that means of the ancient dragon blood. And their central problem on arrival was aging, premature aging. That's why I will build a Shem unto the Lord. They were building what we would now call hermetic, which is electric field generators to reverse aging, which is precisely what our pre-rejuvenation field phase conjugate dielectric technology is. And that's what was mistranslated, mean altar and church. And this is all over the Sumerian. So why did they have the aging problem? Their home planet, originally around Alpha Draconis, high radioactive environment, but then Pleiades was where the family came from, and every indigenous tribe on the planet knows they came from Pleiades. And they had high radioactive environment, and they had high nitrogen environment, and they had very little water. So their blood was lipid-based, and they were nitrogen breathers. This is called the plague of Azoth in French, which means plague of nitrogen breathers. And so we need to know that side of the family. And remember, I'm not saying Draco ancestors are bad. I wouldn't have Kundalini without them, but it's cross that's fun. And EB, bird, Uru, Draco, EB, Uru Hebrew means crossing over. And that's the fun part. So, but we need to know that being nitrogen breathers, oxygen is a poison to them, and ultimately water is a poison to them. They like desert conditions, and radioactivity is a requirement for them because they don't get electron transport. It's like the Paul Brown nuclear battery. You get incredible efficient electron transport from a few little gamma and beta. And the blood chemistry was based on red or white phosphorus, which was the electron pump, as opposed to our blood. Now, when Enki got here and did the cross, he called us Adama Takadama, which means red man, Asaka'an Skanda, because he was fascinated with the iron bond. And the similarity between chlorophyll and hemoglobin is important because it's actually how you bond oxygen that was so unique to us. And that was really the secret of our ensoulment, is the iron-oxygen bond when chlorophyll changed to hemoglobin. And that's the whole reason Enki chose to do his genetic experiments here, actually, the red man, Adama, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So in terms of blood chemistry, what we're reverting to now is a controversy of planet taming called the Oxygen Wars, which is the name of the Orion Wars. And it's sort of the Total Recall Mars story amplified, where you can tell who's winning the conflict of these bloodlines, whether oxygen versus nitrogen is increasing on the planet, and whether radioactivity is increasing on the planet, and whether desert is increasing on the planet. All these indicators tell you who's winning the terraforming battle.
So that's what's going on as a terraforming battle.
Absolutely.
So what we're seeing with Fukushima is an attempt to irradiate the entire planet, to make it to terraform it for a different life form other than us.
Absolutely. That's exactly. And the perfect food for them would be Coca-Cola and French fries, lipid blood. The Coca-Cola phosphorus is, it's digestive. It's, McDonald's is perfect for the Dracos. I don't mean to be too critical here, but there's a tangible, investigatable, biologic example of reverting to Draco blood, and you can read about this on our website. It's at fractalfield.com/negentropic fields. You'll read the blood chemistry story of the Draco. And the couple in Russia that had this experience is called the Aradia couple. They lived too close to Chernobyl, and their blood reverted. And so for them, a radioactive environment is actually healthy.
Okay, so now you've just touched something else. So allegedly, our DNA contains all this junk DNA that has no known purpose. Now, is that the hidden blueprint for us to continue life in a highly irradiated environment? Or are we looking at that type of change within the human race?
Well, first of all, the term junk DNA, I think, is highly unfortunate. It arose because physicists did not understand how DNA is programmed. DNA is, what happens is you have this phase conjugate pump wave, which defines the power spectra of the EKG and EEG during bliss. And you can measure the effect on DNA braiding from human love or bliss. And Glenn Rye did the study at my suggestion. And basically, the DNA braid implodes recursively. The animations are at goldenmean.info/DNA manifesto. And what happens is the short wave versus the long wave gets recursively embedded phase coherently in DNA in the presence of human coherent emotion bliss. And that programs DNA because, and this is the geometric phase coherent relationship of thread to string to rope to fat rope. And it's actually 7 times because the inner thread of DNA is 5 axes spin, but then the braid on the braid is 7, so you have 5, 7, the whole aim of the story. And so then the DNA gets thicker and thicker, the whole N kill story in Anne Rice, and implodes, and you can see this toroidal DNA micro photo pictures and through the microscope on the website. And so what's happening is that the active sites on the DNA is being programmed by the long wave to short ratios, which phase coherence is only possible in the presence of human high emotion. And that's why there's no such thing really as junk DNA, because all these active structures depend on this spacing, which is only possible if the distances between the active sites are phase coherent. And that means there is no junk. So that's the beginning of the story. But really the end of the story is the fact that human DNA had the potential for imploding in the mechanism I just described in such a way that became gravity bending. As a Draco, you didn't make good money unless you could steer a starship. You couldn't steer a starship unless your blood was phase coherent. Like the survivors of Montauk, Philadelphia, whose DNA wasn't phase coherent, they came back scrambled eggs. Whereas the one whose DNA was phase coherent, that's who Charlie the Draco, who ran Montauk, they abducted those teenagers because they could lucid dream and therefore they could steer the time chair, and that's called being a time empath, that whole story. The point was that of the humans abducted by the Greys after the wrong contract was signed by Eisenhower Truman, was 90% of them had indigenous DNA. And you know why? Because they were lucid dreamers, meaning phase coherent. And guess what? If you're a lucid dreamer, you got what they don't.
Okay. So they don't have that phase coherence. Got it.
That's right. But see, the reason they lost it, and this is the important point, this is the Groundhog Day moment. The reason they lost it is only cloning was legal. Hello for them. You see, if you have high radioactive environment, your DNA mutates more. So their opinion was DNA that changes is defective. And this is why the Draco started the aboriginal marriage law and the caste system. Whereas for us, we discovered the opposite, which is called the Monsanto demise, which is that genetic diversity is the only way for DNA to implode and therefore become gravity bending. So it's a very opposite point of view here. And so what we had to take was this.
Well, we've got a break, so hold your thought, Dan. We'll be right back, folks. More with Dan Winter. Stick with us. Be right back in a couple minutes. Good afternoon. Welcome back. This is Mike Harris on Revolution Radio. Today is Thursday, September 18th, 2014. My guest today is Dan Winter. Dan, welcome back, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, I have a question for you. Now, we know that there are some remarkable technologies available. What could we expect to see if your plans go through in the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years? What does humanity have to look forward to?
Well, we believe that by releasing a phase conjugate rejuvenation field, which is negentropic and time reversing, Prairie showed thousands of cases of cancer were healed. We think we know the physics. We understand the key, not just to the negentropy of biology, but how to access zero-point energy, literally the ideal ways to cohere the vacuum. I was just looking again at the famous Tesla Pierce Arrow, the Tesla's car that we know he was very upset with the atomic energy people. And he said, the elegant low energy nuclear reactions could be frequency triggered. And his Tesla car, he learned from the arc lamp of his carbon gizmo, what's called reversible nuclear reactions, which generate huge amounts of energy. Another example of that is the Langmuir atomic hydrogen process. And actually, even Jean-Paul Biberian, Europe's leading fusion physicist, is working on that with us. We're funded in that with the group out of New York, thanks to Roger. And that is a simple, that if you remember, hydrogen is phase conjugate, very fractal. If you split hydrogen efficiently, elegantly, and then recombine in the presence of a catalyst, the equations have proven you have approximately 100 times the energy out versus energy in, and the world's leading physicists have confirmed these equations. So hydrogen energy is a short answer to your question. But the other versions of this that our group is pursuing, one is the reciprocating charger. It's called something called the Bedini charger, but actually again started with Tesla. That if you get phase conjugate resonance between two battery charging circuits, the battery itself is capacitive, that the circuit implodes, conjugates, and you have about 6 times the power out than in. And then you have, of course, Tesla's solid-state charge shuttle oscillator, CSO, which is on the order of same efficiency. It's called COP, coefficient of performance, and based on the same conjugate principle. It's related to what Bearden tried to do, and Bearden was a hero of some of this, with his MEG. It's all based on golden ratio phase conjugate circuits optimized. So basically, using implosion to cohere the vacuum in the same way a pine cone gets voltage from gravity, that's the short answer to the question. And hydrogen energy is at the top of the list.
Oh, so that's the number one thing we can see. We'll wean our dependence off of the oil-based, the oil, coal, what they call fossil fuels. We'll be able to wean off the tit of that, huh?
Well, the thing is, it is a little bit like mother's milk, and weaning is probably the right term. But the moment at which we actually understand is when we understand the nature of the vacuum itself. All these scientists, and they're trying hard, Nassim and others, they have proven the huge amounts of energy available in the vacuum. But the core principle of how you get energy from the vacuum, which is obviously fractal phase conjugate geometries or for charge, implosive, escapes them because they have not studied life. It's life itself. It's the pine cone's source of voltage that actually teaches you the principle. And those people who call it zero-point energy are being a bit childish because, in fact, calling it zero-point or vacuum energy is not bad. But those who call it free energy are being a bit childish because, in fact, it's not free. In fact, it is the gravity field coherent itself, which is tapped. So until this, your local physicist can answer the question, why does an object fall to the ground? He's actually not entitled to have vacuum energy because he doesn't know the origin of negentropy.
Gotcha. Okay, but we've got 20 minutes left. What do you want to talk about? I've been asking questions and just letting you go. What do you want to communicate? What's your message out to the world? How can the listeners assist you? How can they help you with your endeavors? How do we give back to your efforts? Let me that's a good way of stating it.
Well, thank you. Thanks for caring. And I am pleased to collaborate with your network. And I'm very optimistic about the various implosion group technology groups that are hot on the trail right now. I think we're doing great, and the right team is forming, and things are good. I think the way I would like to conclude this might be for the average person listening. It is not so much to say, go back to your physics book, you need physics, although that is true. The more important message here, I actually think, is that that access to bliss is actually the final form of the internet. And let me explain what I mean by that, which gets to the point, well, how do you get there? I was doing a lecture in a church in Italy recently, and I was saying, well, since if you don't have access to getting a way to get your aura charged called bliss, you don't get an immune system, and you don't take memory through death. So basically, bliss is the reason to. It's sort of like why the Celestine prophecy said all human interactions about charge. You select who to kiss and what to eat based on charge acquisition. And so I concluded by saying to the Italians, I said, well, so culture is not the color of your shoe polish and your wine. No, culture is whether you know how to teach your young people how to have a bliss experience. And by that definition, by the way, most of the West does not have culture, because we, in general, do not know how to teach our teenagers how to have a bliss experience. And yet we know functionally now that you can't get an immune system or get immortal otherwise. So, hello, maybe it's important. And anyway, the point was, there was a standing ovation at that moment. I thought I was insulting the Italians. No, they loved it. So, the Aboriginals knew how to teach their teenagers how to have a bliss experience. So therefore, it was a dance, it was a geometry. What ritual dance is, Sufis, it's about the same physics of meiosis and mitosis. It's embedding the shortwave and the long wave and charge acquisition. Bliss experience for molecules. So, well,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, this resolves the question of the hygiene for bliss. That's where I'm going with this. But go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to go ahead and say, how do we get there from here? How do we inculcate our youth? I've got a 15-year-old son, and there's nothing I want for him to do better than is to be able to follow his own bliss and do the things that really matter to him.
Exactly.
And it's tough because he's got these fears of what do other people think. I'm not very good at it. Mm-hmm. Typical insecurities that go with being 15 and not having figured out the world yet. But this is the best time to lay that foundation, to lay that groundwork to figure out the world, so you can spend the rest of your life following your own bliss.
Yeah, and recognize that. Most of our teenagers are absolutely willing to risk their lives in order to get bliss, called sex, drugs, rave concerts, and rock and roll. And the thing that the adults need to recognize is that the teenagers are biologically correct in being willing to risk their lives in order to get bliss, because functionally, if you don't get bliss, you're not going to take memory through death, actually. So, you admire your teenagers for being willing to risk their lives, and instead you provide them with a science manual for how to get there, which is what religion used to be. Now, we wrote a book for teenagers on this called Implosion: Secret Science of Ecstasy and Mortality. You can download the complete color PDF, goldenmean.info/consciouskids. And basically it was, well, how does this translate into hygiene? And what that says, it's kind of the old news, but with new aspects, which is, you need live food, you need genetic diversity in your food, you need yoga, and most of all, you need an environment which is charge dense, which gets to the biologic architecture. You really can't get bliss in dead air, for example. It ain't going to work. And you can't get bliss when you're surrounded with electrosmog. It ain't going to happen. And then, the yoga, the Sufi dance, the ritual, the geometry, the discipline. And then it comes down also to if you can reduce your stress enough to relax, because that's the conductivity of bliss. And then when you get a taste of it, to study the biology of Kundalini, which is what we've talked about. So it does boil down to the old information about learning what charge is. But just for the basic step number one, when Carlos Castaneda said, when you walk into any room, you need to locate the place of power, because that's where your aura can grow. Because all this is resolving to is you make every decision in your life based on whether your aura grows. And by the way, this is not subjective. Download the GDV, bio-well.eu. And you can teach your teenagers why recreational drugs put holes in your aura, and that means you're susceptible to parasites. Growing your aura is not a subjective thing. And then you can make every decision in your life based on whether you get the charge to grow your aura, which is what bliss is. And that's where you begin to realize, who you touch and astral hygiene and all this stuff about growing your aura to the point of having bliss experience.
Well, these things it sounds so simple, but yet it's so profound. And, how come so few people have the skill set to get there from here? It seems like it's like so many people, like we've got caught up. We hear talk about being caught up in the matrix. And like it or not, I've been a lot happier since I don't watch TV. I've been a lot happier since I'm not taking the programming from the outside, that I'm letting my own mind take me where it needs to. It gives me other worries, other fears. One of the things I spend time thinking about these days is, what is this off-planet influence that is trying to herd humanity into a particular set of directions, and when do we get to become captain of our own ship, so to speak, masters of our own destiny, without being interfered with by outsiders who are screwing with us, actually.
Well, and it's in a way, we're looking at the origin of religion, even in your question, because the interference took the form of the Dracos. Actually, we know the same Gabriel, seraphim, which is high-winged Draco, named Gabriel. The same guy narrated the origin of Christianity. He narrated it to Muhammad, and the same guy narrated to Joseph Smith, the Mormons. So it's the same guy, So what was the agenda? Well, it was agenda. It was genetic, and later they apologized if you believe the Nana returns. But the point is that what they were narrating was their best effort at trying to teach us how to have a bliss experience, actually, which is to say hygiene for charge. Even the original laws of kosher, which is really a Draco just saying how he can get his blood nourished. This was their simple ideas about hygiene. The point being that if you take the origin of religion on this planet and you delete miracle worship and personality worship, which is pure childishness, it was, we didn't need that after a few hundred years. All you have left is the science of how to create bliss. That's what religion is. So all the religion wars are simply obviated with science. When you realize the immortalization that was described in the religion wars is basically the science of bliss. And then what you're left with is a simple hygiene. And yet the priority that, 2/3 of the people on the planet Earth are basically willing to die for their religion, or some ridiculous high percentage. They're willing to die for access to bliss. Actually, in fact, Uru Asa LM, Jerusalem, Uru Draco Asa Queen of El, where they make the phase shift. In other words, star portal. So the war over Jerusalem is actually access to the plasma projected place where you can get your aura back up into the stars. And that's really what Amarna was. Akhenaten had a homework assignment from the Syrians, but he screwed up because he couldn't do the checkbook, and then he ran for his life, changed his name to Moses, and took the money called the Ark of the Covenant. That's how
he couldn't find the checkbook.
That's why he couldn't organize a checkbook.
Couldn't organize it. Couldn't keep the Pharaoh's finances in line.
See, the Amun were the Enlil priests, and the Atun, Enki, Akhenaten, was the Enki side of the family. And Enki side of the family was never good with the checkbook, and the Enlil, Amun, Satam side of the family was always ran the checkbook. They were the bankers. And so the bankers of Egypt ran Akhenaten out of town. He changes his name to Moses, swipes the Ark of the Covenant, makes gold powder, and that's how the Essenes got their money. And even Lawrence Gardner confirmed that whole history. So anyway, but his homework assignment that he failed was build Amarna, and Amarna was basically a plasma projective temple in which a group could have bliss together, like lucid dreaming together, which is a real prerequisite. And that's how you could get your soul group back through the heart of the sun. And that's really the only way out of here.
So talk about gold dust, because we hear a lot of I hear a lot of scuttlebutt about monoatomic gold. Where does that come in? Where does that fit in?
Well, the gold atom the reason it's called noble is because the valence electron shells, particularly the outer electron shells, the DF, icosahedrodeca, are complete, noble, implosive, and conjugate. But to get gold atom to be stable in the monoatom state takes a phase conjugate dielectric field, which is what the spark gap was between the gold angels on the Ark of the Covenant. It was a generator for making monoatomic gold, which was called mono-ormes, the spice. It was served in a round white wafer, origin of Holy Communion. And the Dracos were addicted to it because, and that's a very long story, but Thoth, who was really called Tehute Dawid, which is the line of David, which is Thutmosis, the history of the kings of Egypt. Thoth narrated a series of psychological exercises so that you wouldn't get fractionation of personality with your gold powder addiction, but people didn't really get it. But the very more organic forms of the gold powder, which is the agricultural ormes, deep sea water, Barry Carter, subtleenergies.com, these are less dangerous forms because they're pure chemically derived gold powder, like David Hudson, poor guy. I mean, this stuff is actually dangerous. It puts holes in your auras, man. It's quite serious. But an example of gold powder addicted, most of the ascended masters got their sustainable astral body with their gold powder addiction, and then they get to the astral and they don't have any glandular coherence. So they're basically parasites. So there's a very difficult astral hygiene issue with this whole gold powder story. And we have a dozen articles about that, goldenmean.info/gold powder.
Well, again, I'll go, since you mentioned parasites, it does seem that there are off-world parasites that have been feeding off of mankind forever.
Yeah.
How do we get rid of these guys? How do we get rid of these? Ticks are hard enough to get rid of once they dig in. How do we get rid of these guys?
It's the right question. I mean, it's as Monument Valley, Barbara says, is all these stone statues thousands of years old, so the giant astral parasites. We have some pictures at goldenmean.info/geobiology.
By the way, I've got a request from a listener to give out your website again and talk real slow.
Well, they can. The original index, goldenmean.info. The central article about much of tonight's conversation on negentropy is simply fractalfield.com. And that's pretty simple. But to finish the gold powder conversation, so then, and the parasite issue, functionally, originally Enki was pissed that his father, and Lil used his humans as snack food and slaves. This was, we've been parasited for, a few thousand years. But the point was that actually, let's use a metaphor to answer this question, that if you eat dead food, this will attract parasites to your stomach. But you should be grateful because they will eat the death out of you. Now, if you were to eat a dead idea, like God or creative physics, is outside of you, this will attract parasites to your aura. We won't joke about priests here, but you know what I mean, that, parasitic religion. So if, on the other hand, you eat the pure principle of what is creation physics, which does exist inside you, charge compression, implosion, negentropy, phase conjugate, and then you have your source of bliss, implosion. And when you have your source of bliss, all parasitic plasma from in your body to astral is burnt, because parasitic material cannot withstand the presence of implosion. That is the fundamental issue. So if you find people who really have a source of bliss, you will never find a parasite problem. That's the fun. So when you said you wanted to teach your young person how to have access to bliss, you were really telling him how to end the need for parasites. Remember when we said if you don't have a source of bliss, you don't have your own source of charge. So from an electric perspective, you are a parasite.
You are a parasite, yes. Okay, and one other question from a listener, that is, talk about orgonite. Where does this come in? How does this affect the field?
Orgonite uses bad dielectric aluminum or steel shavings inside a plastic resin, which creates a frozen kind of capacitance, which is highly fractionating, which can be useful to break up some geopathics here and there, but it is absolutely useless for assembling any kind of negentropy.
Okay. Well, just like I said, it was just a call from. I mean, there's a question from a listener. Just wanted to address it. Try to be responsive to them. It tells me that people out there are listening and paying attention. So,
Cool.
Dan, you've done a great job today. Like I said, we've got about 4 minutes left. So, what else do you want to cover in this time? I mean, it's a limited window, but I want to make the most of it since I've got you on the air. What should people know? And give out your websites again because I'm getting more about that. Talk slow.
Well, the website about negentropy, and that is what I'd like to end with. The primary article, fractalfield.com. That's not complicated. It's pretty simple. And that's where I have the
It is.
primary article on negentropy. And that's the challenge I would like to put out tonight to everyone out there who thinks they know some science, from the university people to the government people to whoever's listening. This is a challenge to you. I challenge you to prove me wrong that frequency signature, Planck length time, exponent's golden ratio, does not in fact account for all self-organization, all negentropy, and the cause of gravity, the cause of perception, and the cause of life force itself. I challenge them to look, for example, and I am challenging the scientists in your audience. I have proven that you take exactly Planck time, exact exponent's golden ratio, not only to get the Earth year and the Venus year, could that be a coincidence? No. And you get exactly, there are only two frequencies that motorize photosynthesis. So I tell you, scientists out there, I challenge you to give any other explanation for that than to say that photosynthesis is a phase conjugate pump wave, and that's why it's negentropic. That's why gravity exists. That's why perception exists. That's why life force exists. That is the only path out of chaos. And I challenge any scientist in your audience anywhere to prove me wrong. That's how I want to end that. Because if you get that, then all the other conclusions I've drawn here are irrefutable. So that's my little standing on a chair.
Okay. Well, the only thing I have to say to that is, don't hold back. Tell us how you really feel. Well, that was a joke. I mean,
I got excited.
I got the passion in your voice here that you
But
are
you
convinced.
do
You
a
are
simple.
convinced that this is the key.
That's absolutely. You do a simple curve. The frequencies that cause photosynthesis, there's actually only two. Green actually prevents photosynthesis. That's why every plant's green, because it's opposite to conjugate. So there's only two frequencies that make photosynthesis work. So I challenge any scientist out there to say why golden mean multiples, exactly time Planck time, give you those two frequencies. Photosynthesis and life force exists because it's a phase conjugate bump wave, just like the frequencies of Schumann and brainwaves for Bliss. The whole thing, it all fits together so beautifully, it's got to be right.
Well, sometimes the pieces of the puzzle come together and they all fit and it's perfect and it sounds like you solved it. It sounds like you solved it.
It's just so beautiful. And it's like, it looks like a caduceus and it's a phase conjugate bump wave. And that's what Hermes was talking about. It's life.
And that's why the caduceus is still the medical symbol. It's been there forever. It's been right in front of us, and yep. We've been too slow to figure it out.
So now we have it hermetically sealed.
So, anyway, I need to make a public little housekeeping announcement, folks. Tomorrow I'm traveling. I won't be on the air. Hopefully, going to have a replay or something set up for you, not dead air. But they're aware. I just won't be here. I will be here all next week. But tomorrow I will not be here.